Great, hi. Good evening. I think we'll start. Welcome. My name's Shumon Basar. Thanks for coming. Thanks to my guests this evening, to Micheal Brooke and to Harry Giles, who is and isn't here, will appear on these various screens shortly. And also thanks to Touring for crowdsourcing at the highest level, bringing Harry Giles to my attention. It's really been fantastic. So, just a quick introduction to the format. Samuel Beckett once said about James Joyce's work in progress, which would later become Finnegan's Wake, that form is content and content is form. Inspired by these words, format is about the shapes that discourse takes. How has knowledge been formatted into disciplines, institutions, and technologies? What's the grammar of how we know things in the past and today? What are the mannerisms, the archetypes, and stereotypes of things being said? And if there are hidden politics to presentation, what exactly are there? So, what might I mean when I say protest format? Okay, to start, let's look at this image. What is it? You may know where it is, when it was, but what is it? Let's look at this image as an image. What do we see? People gathered in a shape defined by the roads, by the River Nile, a crowd resisting, a movement residing in a space normally meant for movement, a movement resisting movement. This image has arguably become a visual shorthand for the collectively termed Arab uprisings that dominated 2011. This despite the fact that, according to popular recent mythology, the wave of events began in Tunis, with a Tunisian street vendor self-immolating himself as a protest against, well, you know the story. Mohamed Bouazizi's desperate actions, which are perhaps the ultimate form that protest can take, took place in December 2010. Yet, it's not until Egyptians occupied and transformed Tahrir Square in January 2012, along with the battles on the bridges and on the streets, that we are offered something heroic, inspiring, something that speaks of the power of crowds, the crowds protesting. Zoom in and you see a tangle of electricity cables, mobile phones being charged up, laptops. Close by are generators to power communication networks, because this protest was much larger than the area it physically occupied. It was as big as the images and sounds produced there could be broadcast across the world. Famously, at one point, Al Jazeera was live streamed into the square, showing documentaries about other historical revolutions, thus not only recording history in the making, but attempting to influence it directly. Now, does any of this suggest a new relationship between the individual and the crowd under the name of protest? In 2011, I traveled from curfew-besieged Manama in Bahrain to the social movement of protests in Tel Aviv, to Liberty Plaza in New York, one of the core coordinates of the Occupy movement. All of these protests and more led, of course, to Time magazine, making The Protester the Person of the Year last December. Yesterday, WikiLeaks dumped 2 million diplomatic cables with Syria onto the internet. WikiLeaks, Lulzsec, Anonymous, protesters too, though protesters who highlight the line between indirect and direct action. Julian Assange in an interview said that one of the ways in which revolutionary information was distributed through Egypt during the revolution was as printed pamphlets across youth soccer clubs. Old media becomes new media again. And just today, I received an email from Stop the War movement asking for donations so that they can finish their documentary on, quote, the largest protest in human history, which is, of course, the February 15, 2003 global protest against the invasion of Iraq, where, Stop the War claim, up to 30 million people in nearly 800 cities around the world took to the streets. So, what was persistent in this protest format? What has to be invented? What has to be abandoned? These are some of the questions that I'd like to ask tonight to both my guests and to you, the audience. So, without much further ado, I want to introduce my first guest this evening. He is Harry Giles. Harry Giles makes political theatre, which in itself I think is a very intriguing format category. He can't be with us physically today, but he's going to be on our screens now. And then after this short video presentation that he's made for us, we'll have him live and we'll have a short conversation to pick up on some of these points. So, hold on, let me see. Harry?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for the introduction. I thought I should just say hello to everybody there who came to the video that have arrived online.
Fantastic. So we're going to press play now, Harry, and then we'll come over to you in about 18 minutes, okay?
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Hello everybody, I'm Harry, and it's really good to be with you today, even if it's just virtually. Just to tell you a little bit about who I am, where I'm coming from. I'm a political theatre maker. In fact, I'm not with you physically because I'm at a political theatre festival in Italy. But being a theatre maker and being interested in politics means that I'm very engaged with the way that we do politics, the way that we perform politics, take part in politics. It's something that really obsesses me and drives my work and that I've done a good amount of research into, which is how I've ended up speaking to you today. I'm also somebody who actively participates in social movements, in activist actions, in protests. So I'm speaking here as a participant, talking about what I'm part of. That's what informs what I'm speaking about, and it's where the slants might come from. I always think a good place to start when you're analysing a cultural phenomenon is the Wikipedia page about it. Because there's no better way to look at the aggregate experience of a whole bunch of people, at least at first look. The page for protest is particularly fascinating because it lists a whole bunch of different things a protest can be. It lists march, picket, placard, lock-on, die-in, protest song, radical cheerleading, bike rides, petitions, letters, nudity, sit-in, camps, occupations, riots, self-immolation, suicide, hunger strike, bombing, tax resistance, conscientious objecting, flag burning, judicial activism, strike, walkout, boycott, zine, soapboxing, samizdat, graffiti, Twitter storm, culture jamming, book burning. What is it that links all this stuff? The etymology of the word helps a little. It's Latin from pro, before, and testare, testify. It means to declare publicly, to speak out. Protest is originally a form of speech, and it's notable that many of the things in that list are particularly marked forms of speech. But it's also notable that it doesn't come to mean specifically an expression of dissent or a dissenting action until the 1950s, where we get the idea of protest march for the first time through the American Civil Rights Movement. And what we now understand as protest is a very new phenomenon. In this short talk, I'm going to try and talk about how protest, rebellion, resistance has changed in format in the last few centuries, how we got to where we are now. I'm going to look at 3 different moments of protest through history, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now, which I think is the beginning of something quite new. It's important to say that what I'm talking about has a particularly European American angle, mainly through time limitations. So let's just register that. Okay, so let's start by going way back to the 17th century in Scotland. It's 1637. Britain is Protestant, and Scotland is very Protestant indeed, and very serious about it. A new Book of Common Prayer has been printed, commissioned by King Charles, and it's seriously unpopular because everyone thinks it seems pretty Catholic, a way of reintroducing Catholicism by stealth. We're in St Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh. The Dean of Edinburgh begins reading the service for the first time, and then a woman named Jenny Geddes stands up and shouts, so we're told, "Deal call it away, me fous, thief Dorius, say mass in mile one," which basically means, what is this Catholic nonsense? And then she flings her stool at the Dean. A riot breaks out in the streets of Edinburgh and lasts for at least a day. The city chambers are sieged. Eventually there's a truce. Some agreement on the service is reached. But this is just one of many, many incidents that led to the English Civil War. And what I want to say about this is that it's so different from any petition or march we know now. Protest in the 17th century is necessarily violent, necessarily part of a rebellion. The power of the king, the church, the state, these are all absolute. So as soon as you speak out, protest against that, you're necessarily outside the law. If a petition can get you hanged, you may as well fling a stool or arm yourselves and start a war. Protest is always riot, always part of a rebellion, a revolution. Sometimes it's spontaneous and sometimes it's planned. We don't know if Jenny Geddes was at a plant and her actions scripted like that of Rosa Parks, the woman who sat down on a bus and galvanised the civil rights protests. But unlike those 1950s protests, everything we see back then is of this very different, rebellious format. Let's go forward a couple hundred years. It's 1848. There are revolutions across Europe, in France, Italy, Germany, Denmark, Poland, and plenty others besides. In the UK, the most popular movement, though, is not revolutionary, but Chartism, a series of demands for political representation. Universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, pay for MPs, annual elections. In sharp contrast to mainland Europe, it explicitly frames itself as a peaceful movement. They run rallies, petitions, meetings, marches. On the 10th of April, they hold an extraordinary meeting in Kennington Common. 150,000 people gathering in this one big green public space for speeches, games, music, meetings. Though it's framed as peaceful, the meeting is charged by thousands of police officers, mostly special recruits. Street battles continue throughout the day. 200 to 300 of the Chartists are killed. There's a fight outside Paddington Station for 6 hours. The movement petered out in the following months, but it's worth saying that all the demands, bar annual elections, were enacted within 25 years. So we've got a very different kind of protest here, a different format. It's not a rebellion, not a contribution to revolution. It's a protest for political rights, for the right to participate in state politics. It's being explicitly framed as peaceful so that it can frame itself, demand to be a part of that politics. The actions adopt formats the organisers hope will be acceptable to the state. They're trying to ask for the liberal protest rights, the rights that make protest part of state politics. They speak out, they protest, but they aren't trying to threaten the foundation or structure of the state. In this case, though, the state does see their actions as a threat. They attack the protest, and yet this is a key moment in developing the idea of protest rights, of protests that can be a part of political discourse. Chartism sets the stage for certain types of protest as part of mainstream political discourse. Fast forward 150 years and things are very different again. The modern idea of protest has been invented, born in the struggle for civil rights in America. In that movement, of course, the division between peaceful and violent protest is well attested with these twin figureheads. The Cold War is now over. Neoliberalism has declared the end of history. The era of tumultuous revolutions is seen to be past. The state is now global through institutions like the UN, the IMF, the G8. It's nearly the millennium. November 30th, 1999, and we're in Seattle. The target is a meeting of the World Trade Organization, a convention of ministers setting new rules for international commerce. They're widely seen as the architects of neoliberal globalization. 40,000 activists gather in the city, a mix of anti-capitalist, environmentalist unions, indigenous movements, anarchists, and just about everybody with any kind of anti or ultra-globalization agenda. At the beginning of the day, blockades take control of key intersections. Then marches converge on this central territory and widen the area controlled by activists. Delegates are prevented from reaching the convention centre or their hotels, and the police forces are split in two. The activists hold parties, teach-ins, and face off against the police. Later on, black bloc groups start attacking storefronts, and around the same time the police begin using pepper spray, tear gas, stun grenades, rubber bullets. The initial standoff becomes a series of running battles that continue to shut down that conference. Meanwhile, some groups of non-violent protesters try to protect targeted storefronts, and the later Labour rally draws thousands away from the conflict. Largely as a result of all of these very many different actions, the WTO court talks collapse and the movement claims victory. A lot of different things are going on here, and so I'll try and unpack it bit by bit. First is the idea of one no, many yeses, a slogan of the movement. All these different movements have different aims, different agendas. They're united only by their opposition to neoliberal globalization. Seattle is the convergence of many local campaigns from different places, converging together to try and attack the whole neoliberal hegemony. The neoliberal monolith is opposed by a heterogeneous movement of movements. The second thing that's going on here is the distinction between violent and non-violent protest, between reform and revolution, has begun to collapse. The watchword of the movement of movements is diversity of tactics. So you see a blockade and a rally, a window smashing and a petition happening under the same banner. Remember that list of all the different forms of protest that I began with. You see all of these as part of the same wider movement. You see all of these different tactics being used for the same aims by different people. True, some of the protesters condemn others, and there is division and debate within the movement, but there's also a common understanding that these different protest formats are somehow part of the same thing. A result of neoliberalism declaring hegemony, declaring the end of history, building itself as a monolith, is that resistance becomes united against that monolith, outside of that hegemony. We're back in an era, as we were before, of all-powerful empires or states, of one monolithic thing in which any action places itself outside. I hope that explains a little bit about where we've come from and where we've got to. how the contemporary protest format has been developed. So I'm going to finish off by talking a little bit about what's happening now. In 2001, 9/11 happens, and in 2007 a global financial meltdown begins. Between these two massive global events, history has started again. There are new global narratives. One of them is American neoliberalism versus Islamic fundamentalism, this big story about what the world is now. Another is the rise of the Chinese economy and its eventual dominance, another big story about what's happening in the world. There's also a huge economic question, with the ongoing economic depression alongside the threat of global climate change. There's now much greater questioning of neoliberal globalization as the only socio-economic possibility. Things seem more open. History is moving. Cue the Arab Spring, Occupy, the UK riots, the Indignados, the Greek riots, the Montreal student protest movement. After taking a few years off, the movement of movements seems to be back. But we're seeing a lot less of that kind of cross-movement unity that we had a decade ago. There are gestures in its direction, especially under the Occupy banner, but really it's hard to link a park occupation against corrupt banking practices with a street-led revolution against a dictatorship. The formats are totally different. The actions might look the same, the occupation of public spaces, but they're framed in completely different ways. When thought of in terms of their role within state political protests, you have the same actions, but different formats. There's no joint target now, as there was in 1999. There is no end of history historical monolith to oppose. The future is uncertain again. We don't know the rules anymore. Our protests are diverse, have multiple targets, separate formats. Solidarity and communication takes place through the internet, not through summit convergences. We don't know where we're headed or what we're headed against. We don't know what's shaping our format, and that's why you see these diverse and unfocused movements. This last part of the talk is really a series of questions rather than descriptions or statements. I spoke with confidence about how the format of protest changed from 1600 to 2000. From those years I could say more definite things because we've got enough critical distance to see that history clearly. I know the big narratives to that point. Right now though, we're in the heat of it. We're in the middle of an extraordinary moment of global protest and we don't know what it is yet. It's too early to tell. We're in new territory. I think that new formats will emerge. So at this moment of uncertainty in my talk, at this moment of questioning, I think it's best to open it up to all of you. That's everything that I have thought for you. I'd like to hear what you have, what ideas you have about what is it that's happening now. So let's get some thoughts or questions from yourselves. And I hope if we've got the technology right, that I'll be able to participate.
Hi, Harry.
Good. So you've got me.
We got you.
Good stuff.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that presentation.
Pleasure.
It was really fantastic, and I can't think of a better way to kickstart this whole event. I've got a few questions for you. Michael's next to me as well, and ask him to pitch in. And we have an audience, so we'll see how it goes. My first question, in a minute I want to move on to something more personal, which is, I guess, what you do, and this designation of making political theatre, and its relationship to something you said earlier, which is your interest in performing politics. Right? But before we get on to that, I was just wondering, I know I asked you, and I also have asked Michael, a kind of impossible impossible tasks to compress decades, hundreds of years of history into a relatively short time. So you had to be selective, of course. But I was wondering, had you, prior to putting this presentation together, already thought of protest as a format, and as a format that has sort of that has an evolution and a genealogy?
Yeah. So I think it's probably ever since I've thought about protest being somewhere in my mind. But one of the reasons it's at the forefront at the moment is that the performance project I'm working on right now is a project called This Is Not a Riot, which is, well, it's a project about riots. It's trying to get the idea of what riots are, looking at what they are and where they come from and what we do when we're stuck in one. I've been working on that for about a year in various places, so just through that show I've got myself very stuck into the format of one particular form of protest, which is the riot. So I suppose that's why I came into it, was just kind of studying that for a theatre project. So it's also, I think, one of the things that characterises protest movements when you take part in them is, and I think it's often not shown in the media, but most activist organisations, most protest movements are constantly engaged in this process of thinking about what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve and how they should get it. There's this constant debate about what protest is, so that when you're doing protest, you're always thinking about the formats that you're using and why you use them. It's just part of how we do it.
And would you say, what would you say the relationship between activism and protest is?
That's
does one belong to the other? Is one a format of the other, or is one the means to produce the other?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because I mentioned in the talk that the idea of the protest march, I only touched on it, but that kind of grew out of the 50s. We didn't actually see it etymologically until then, and it's only from then that we start thinking about protest as an event rather than as this talking action. Activism, the idea of activism is a big thing, is an even newer invention, at least linguistically speaking. I think that protest is a much wider and broader and more inclusive category than activism, because as you saw from that list right at the beginning of the talk, a protest can be anything from one angry tweet to 1 million people on the streets of London. Whenever anybody speaks out against something or speaks for something, that's a form of protest. Activism is actually this is a way of separating off part of your life, or part of what you do is this special thing called activism that leads to this special category called activist, that's the person who's specially qualified to do activism. And this is the stuff that I think it's good to be quite skeptical about. There's a significant essay called Give Up Activism that kind of questions that format a lot, that was published in the early 2000s. So I think, protest is this broader, more inclusive category than activism, which is more of a limited kind of format, a more limited design.
And I'm interested in when you're producing this genealogy or this history that you showed us. Could you get an idea of how one might assess the success of each format of protest? I mean, is it nearly always simply whether or not its goals, the goals are achieved, or are there other criteria through which we might assess the protest format?
I'm not sure there's any one answer to that question. And that part of, I suppose, what I was trying to get at with that talk is that the format that protest takes. We're right. The format that protest takes is historically contingent. Like, the kind of protests we do depend on our historical social circumstances. So what works and what doesn't work in one place and one time is different from in another place and time. And what works in London now is different from what works in Egypt now, in Cairo, and what works in one place now is different from another place now. I'm not sure. On top of that kind of level of variation, I'm skeptical of of the idea of evaluating protest per se, of saying this thing succeeded and this thing didn't. Protest tends to be more of a process, of a period of change, of continual struggle, rather than. Here's this distinction between protest and activism again. So in activism, you might make a petition or get 100 people at a rally demanding one thing, and then if you get that demand, you win, and if you don't get that demand, you lose. But this broader idea of protest is a very wide format and a very inclusive format. It's much more about the process of change, the process of countering hegemony, I called it in the talk. You could just say power. That was quite a rambling answer, but I hope it got at something that you're asking there.
Absolutely, and that perhaps leads me to my next question, which is, if it's historically contingent in relation to what it is that it's protesting against, you said at the beginning that what we consider to be protest is probably a relatively recent phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe at some point you mentioned the 50s, of course, and but I was wondering how much, if on the one hand it's historically contingent on certain ideas or notions of power or concentrations of power, what role then does technology and the media obviously then play? Because the 50s and the 60s are obviously a particular era in terms of the advent of mass media.
God, these are good questions, because that's not a huge, you're right that in the genealogy I gave, I mainly talked about power as the main determining condition of protest, and now you've thrown technology in there. There's a whole other genealogy to tell. We can talk about how protest changes in response to technology. The story that I told was the story of the evolution of the state, effectively, and the evolution of empire, and how we moved from kind of small states where that are struggling to maintain control to these vast empires, to this big globalized world that we have now. And that's the story of changing power and how protest changes in response to that. Technology is another big area, and anything I answer now is going to be a bit of a ramble, but...
Well, just to let you know, Harry, Michael's just told me that his talk, very convenient, is going to focus on this, and I guess particularly in relation to film, in relation to how film technology...
So I'm going to say I'm not an expert on this, apart from saying that every technology that's invented and that becomes part of our life is partly determines how power is used, and is partly determined by power. So the internet's a big thing. When the internet started, it was seen as this big part, well, apart from the military connections where it grew, but when it first became public, it was seen as this big participatory project, a big open, anarchic space where anything could happen. A couple of decades later, what we now see is an internet that's largely colonized by huge companies, where most of our internet time is spent on something like Facebook or Amazon. The internet has become a gigantic shopping mall, which is where what you can say is determined by a corporation, where what you can do, the type of action that you take place is determined by their rules. Facebook's another really good example here. So here we have this big system that people now use for organizing protest and use for their own ends and use to counter power, but that's also determining what they do in the type of power that we have in the world determines how it can be used. It limits how it can be used. So there's one answer.
Fantastic. And maybe just to ask you more specifically about what it is that you do as political theatre. Could you maybe give us a few examples of what distinguishes political theatre from non-political theatre, as it were?
Okay. So all public performance involves gathering people in a space, whether it's a virtual space or a real space, and whenever you bring a group of people together, there's something political there. All theatre is political, all art is political. I suppose what I'm interested in is art that foregrounds that political dimension. I suppose the thing that I don't do is make theatre about politics. I love some political playwrights. I think David Hare, for example, has done some great work, and his theatre is very much about politics. He writes shows that discuss political questions. What I'm interested in and what I try to do is theatre that is politics. in one way or another, that is a political action. A recent project that I've been working on, which was actually down in London at the Oval House, was called Class Act, and it was a kind of an exploration of the idea of class war. But it was also a kind of challenge to the audience to declare class war, actually. And at the end of the show, very explicitly, I said, so are you a worker and do you want to declare class war? And in that sense, it was a kind of political act, but framed in an artistic context. So I'm interested in stuff that is art and is politics at the same time. And that can happen in the theatre space, but it can also happen in a protest space. And theatre is part of protest space. It's obviously a huge part of what makes protest a celebratory and enjoyable thing to be part of.
Well, that would probably be my last question to you, which is, if there's obviously a traditional political theatre which takes politics or politicality as its subject, has protest, by definition, always taken theatrics as a part of its format, and I guess at the same time, therefore, also produced a certain kind of theatrics by doing so.
Yes and no as well. This is also a story about the genealogy of art, because art is another of these things that's a comparatively recent invention. Art is something that's separate from the rest of life, or art is a practice that one can do, is another invention of the last couple of 100 years. So, yes, I think protest has always been a little bit theatrical. It's always been about communicating something, about performing something or sending a message. Even when, as I argued, all protest was rebellion, all protest was riot, you didn't always have to burn something down to get what you wanted. You could just threaten to burn something down. And a threat is a piece of theatre, in a way. But that's very different from the way that a lot of protest is now theatre. If you think about a big iconic march like the Stop the War March in London, the anti-Iraq War March, that was a massive piece of theatre. It was a lot of people communicating in a big celebratory, artistic way. We do not want this thing to happen. But it was just a communication of a message. It was just a performance of protest. It wasn't direct action. It wasn't directly taking something. And so there you sort of kind of protest that was only theatre and not something else at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's a wee touch for you.
Thank you so much.
No problem. No problem.
Michael, I can either bring you in here, or we can have your presentation and we can try and have a conversation.
Well, I've got one question actually, which I was quite intrigued by your comments about sort of certain kinds of protest manifestations that started in the 50s. Because I'm about to show footage of things like sort of suffragette marches from 1911. So what changed?
So we went back to the suffragettes, and there were marches then. It's important to know, of course, that suffragette was a derogatory term invented by, I think, the Daily Mail, actually, to do down the suffragist movement, which is what they call themselves. And it's also important to know that the majority of suffragist action was direct action, was things like chaining to railings and throwing yourself in front of the king's horse. She didn't mean to die though, and mailing patent poison to MPs and overturning park benches. The direct action is a huge and now largely forgotten part of the suffragist movement. The big thing that changed, and what I tried to argue, and the reason, and there has for a long time been marched, even the Chartists did march, the big thing that changed was the creation of a state-allowed form of protest, a permitted form of protest, so that you have the popular protest march alongside the state-sanctioned strike as these big bastions of liberal democracy, as part of our liberal political process. And once you embed that as part of state politics, the idea of the protest march grows and becomes bigger and more commonplace. So by the time you have the civil rights movement, there's a really fully formed dialectic opposing the revolutionary activism that you can see figureheaded by Malcolm X to the engaged, state-oriented activism that you can see figureheaded by Martin Luther King. So The distinction between violent and non-violent protest, between a passive protest march and direct action, has been around for a while, and it was there at the time of the Chartists, but it doesn't become fully evolved, I don't think, until we reach that 1950s point.
Fantastic. Harry, we're gonna keep things moving here.
Sure.
Please stay online, and then we can bring you in after Michael's talk, and then
Very
we'll
good.
bring the audience as well. So will you please big round of applause and thank you to Harry. Okay, so my next guest, you've met him briefly, is Micheal Brooke. Michael writes about film, and in my opinion, he has an exquisite archival mind when it comes to the history of cinema. It's really amazing, not only his mind, but his ability to also...
I should probably mention I actually worked for the BFI National Archive for the better part of a decade, so it doesn't...
Absolutely, so these things are fused. As he says, he's been a stalwart at Sight and Sound and the BFI here in London, with a special focus on Eastern European, Central Eastern European cinema, and also animation, and recently brought the amazing work of the brothers Quay to Blu-ray?
Mostly DVD.
Blu-ray. So I've asked Michael to again draw a sort of impossibly brief portrait of protest as seen on cinema, but also through the medium of film itself. So a case of one formatting another format. So will you please join me in welcoming Micheal Brooke.
Right, well I'm going to be covering just one century rather than three, but there's still more than enough to go on. One thing that became very clear indeed when I was given this brief is A, that it's impossible. I mean, this is something people write several books about. And B, there are huge, great things I'm going to have to leave out. For example, I barely touched on television, which is another talk in itself. But what I hope I've managed to do is that the clips I've put together, which are mostly going to be shown chronologically, give you some idea about the way that protest has been recorded on film and other moving image media, how the actual film has become part of the protest, ranging from little sort of independently produced things on tiny budgets to, in one case, a sort of Palme d'Or winning feature film. But we're going to turn the clock back to pretty much exactly 100 years ago, because the history of cinema was really invented in the mid-19th century. The middle of the last decade of the 19th century, the mid-1890s. But the history of protest on film really begins around about 1910, which is when we get the first regular newsreels. And protests of various kinds were very popular with the early newsreel cameramen because they offered the happy combination of being both newsworthy and very often very eye-catching. And also the people organising the protests were usually very happy to be filmed. In fact, only too happy. It gave them the kind of conduit that they'd never had before. This, for instance, is a large-scale demonstration. It's a sort of suffragist pageant from 1911, commemorating women through the ages. Now, although this would have been shown sort of up and down the country, the newsreels had a fairly sophisticated distribution network. The downside from the demonstrators' point of view is they had no control over either the shooting of the footage itself or the editorial use to which it was put afterwards. This newsreel is pretty benign. It's just a recording of what happened. I think it probably helped that the procession itself wasn't particularly controversial, it was just commemorating women in history. But when you get on to more controversial incidents, one of which has already been mentioned, things get rather more complicated. 4th of June 1913 saw one of the most notorious incidents in the history of the suffragist movement, when Emily Davison apparently flung herself deliberately under the King's horse. Of course, whether or not it was deliberate has been endlessly contested by historians. But anyway, she sustained fatal injuries, and more to the point, it was actually captured by several cameras, several newsreels, and I was particularly intrigued by how Gaumont Graphic built their footage of the incident. Here we go. First of all, they misspelled her name. But just look at the phrase, the thrilling incident, as though this was some kind of, bonus sporting event laid on the entertainment of the masses. It's not even true, actually, because as the footage reveals, the incident was anything but thrilling. In fact, it was shockingly sudden and over in seconds. And in fact, I was reminded of this very vividly with the boat race disruption earlier this year, which again is just it's basically just a head bobbing in the water. It's not actually particularly interesting in image itself. It's the construction that we built in it afterwards that made the media impact. Right. Okay. Have a look at this. More suffragettes. Okay, I'm guessing from the reaction of some of you, you've already worked out that this is not authentic footage. They weren't in the habit of filming themselves taking part in arson-related terrorism. And they certainly wouldn't have made themselves quite so readily identifiable. This is actually a scene from a film called Milling the Militants from 1913, and it's an example of a genre that has been obsolete for almost as long. It's the anti-suffragette comedy. And it's an example of how the mainstream film industry, which was heavily, in fact, it was pretty much entirely male-dominated, fought back. This is the husband of one of the vedettes, and throughout the rest of the film, he's going to be dreaming of various ways of sort of wreaking revenge on her plans, which he can't actually carry out himself because he's too much of a coward. I'm going to leave the next slide away. Now, when war broke out in 1914, newsreels generally treated the women's rights with more respect, largely for practical reasons, because it became very apparent very quickly that for all the jibes about women being incapable of doing men's work, the historically unprecedented carnage that was going on the front of the First World War meant that this would have to be put to the test regardless. And of course, as you know, they did so well that they were, it's one of the things that led directly to them being granted the vote in 1918. But other forms of protest were also being recorded by newsreels. Pacifism was something that was an obvious target for other forms of protest. When Topical Budgets, which is one of the three main newsreel companies and the only British one, signed a deal with the War Office, this was very useful to them because it gave them financial support, it gave them exclusive access to extremely newsworthy footage of people and incidents. But it also meant that they had to promote the government line at every possible opportunity. So this is how they covered a pacifist demonstration in 1916, the year of the Somme. And one of the things that's particularly noteworthy about this, you don't actually see the pacifists until they're sort of dragged out through the windows. The protest they feel here is overwhelmingly the one by forces loyal to the crowd who are clearly just determined to maintain the status quo. Even after the war, when the alliance with the government had ended, Topical Budget still maintained what we would now recognise as a strongly Daily Mail, Fox News editorial line. This, for instance, is how they covered the 8-week strike of mid-1923, when 50,000 dockers brought 9 major docks to a complete standstill. As you can see, the title is just sneering about, and now your food's going to cost you more. The food ships are held up by the dockers' unauthorised pocket money strike. Actually, I mean, what they were complaining about was a wage cut, compulsory wage cut of 12%, which is a not insignificant amount. And again, here we have. It's basically just sort of reinforcing, using words like idle, showing lots of shots of the dockers. At no point are you told, you're given anything concrete about what they're actually protesting. We're going to see some dockers towards the end of this. Yes, on the beach, look, here they are. Here they are, basically sunning themselves. And sadly, I don't have a copy, but there's a similar film about the 1921 coal strike, which was really, really massive, and one of the biggest in the last century. And this was described as the greatest menace we have ever known. And it's sort of intercut shots of striking miners watching the football while their pit ponies drowned in the flooded mines. But also in the 1920s, about the same time, the Bolshevik government in the fledgling Soviet Union was developing its own film policy. Lenin famously regarded the cinema as the most important of all the arts, and the great Soviet filmmakers of the mid to late 1920s turned it into an unprecedentedly powerful and sophisticated propaganda tool. And very often, certainly in films like Battleship Potemkin, they would recreate famous protests of the past, restage them on a bigger scale, shoot them with dynamically composed, consciously heroic myth-making images, and edited with an aggressive rhythmic drive that remains intoxicating to this day. Now this is Sergei Eisenstein's October, commissioned to mark the 10th anniversary of the storming of the Winter Palace. And even if you've never seen the film before, you may well recognise these images, because in the absence of any footage of the actual historical event, because a newsreel cameraman at the time would struggle to get any usable footage at all at night, it turns up constantly in documentaries about the Russian Revolution, and sometimes it's not even clear that it isn't the actual footage. In real life, the storming of the Winter Palace was conducted on a much, much smaller scale. Now, the films of Eisenstein and his colleagues were sometimes banned, Battleship Potemkin most notoriously until the 1950s, and they were almost invariably given highly restricted distribution in Britain. But they were screened at private film clubs like London's famous Film Society, where they were watched by many of the men who went on to found the great British documentary movement of the 1930s. These men were also strongly left-wing and very excited by the possibilities that the Soviet filmmakers had shown them. One of them, Ralph Bond, regarded the newsreel as, quote, the most effective weapon for imperialist propaganda in the cinema today. And he set about making an alternative, shot very cheaply with a borrowed camera, and screened at the inaugural meeting of the London Workers' Film Society. This is an extract from the first issue of the Workers' Topical News from 1930. As you can see, this is a mass demonstration protesting about the unemployment level. But as you can see, unlike the topical budget news, the coverage is entirely sympathetic. Three editions were made in total, but after that, other organisations took up the idea, including the Socialist Film Council and the Workers' Film and Photo League. There was very little question of these films ever getting any kind of commercial distribution, but there were enough private film societies to give them a reasonable level of circulation. And then, the early 1930s saw another revolution, the coming of sound, which, from the point of view of film protests, meant that filmmakers could finally give their subject an authentic voice, as demonstrated here in one of the many genuine slum dwellers complaining about their living conditions in the famous 1935 documentary Housing Problems. Ooh. Yeah. And here is Mrs. Graves.
Well, I've been here for 24 years, and this last one, it has been a mystery to me. My boss came by in the front room, I had my bed down, put in the bed. I went to bed early. I had a baby 25. In the morning, instead of getting up the children for school, they had been awake all night. I let the children lie as the baby went to sleep for the first time. So our little black dog kept running about. So I must have dozed off with the baby. Thinking it was a dog on my ear, I looked up, and still as that was a big rat. I screamed and ran out and left the baby. I had to put the dirt into my bowl. Take it through the kitchen window and out through the kitchen. We cannot get it out of the passage on account of the shoring up. We had no cup for food, not even to put a bit of bread in. We leave anything on the table for the night time. We had the rats.
During World War II, a great deal of documentary production in Britain fell under the auspices of the Ministry of Information, which was keener on propaganda than protest. I mean, obviously there were a lot of anti-Hitler protests, but those weren't exactly newsworthy in themselves. But there was one remarkably imaginative example of a protest film made directly in response to a real-life atrocity. In this case, the obliteration of the Czech village of Lidice, which was carried out by the Nazis in 1942 in reprisal for the assassination of Reichsprotector Reinhard Heydrich. The Lidice massacre would be the only act of genocide to be recognised as such actually during World War II itself, largely because the Nazis were only too happy to take the credit for it as a warning to others. But because of its high profile, it also became a rallying point for public protest, with various Lidice committees springing up in several countries. The Washington branch numbered Albert Einstein, Charles Chaplin and Thomas Mann among its members. And in 1943, only a few months after the massacre, the British documentary maker Humphrey Jennings made a film about it, Silent Village, which is one of the most memorable protest films ever made. In this early scene, the Nazis have taken over and have become persecuting the local community by denying them their linguistic rights.
Songs, our poems are to be heard no more. But children, I want you to promise me one thing. Do not forget your Welsh. Speak Welsh at home, on the roadside, at your play, everywhere. Will you promise me not to forget your Welsh language? Yes, Miss Daniel.
A lot of propaganda films claimed to feature footage from parts of Europe that was actually restaged in places like Wales. But Jennings didn't make a secret of it. The reason for this is that it was only 4 or 5 years since Neville Chamberlain's notorious comment about Czechoslovakia being a faraway country of which we know little. So by imagining how the events of Lidice would play out in the demographically identical Welsh village of Kiev, Jennings made them far more immediate to a British audience, particularly when the male victims start singing Land of Our Fathers at the point of Nazi guns. Many decades later, the Czechs made their own film about Lidice, and I assumed it wouldn't have anything to offer this talk. It wasn't torn from the headlines in the way that Jennings' film was. And it's essentially a memorial, not a work of ongoing protest. But then I was taken completely by surprise at the end. At the very end of the film, we fade out on Lidice's only male survivor. He was in prison while the massacre was going on. And then, so he's contemplating the village that's actually been literally razed to the ground. It's no longer there. And then we get the obligatory end title that sets a sort of historical context, with obviously any act of genocide that was recognised as such in World War II, 173 male victims, 53 women shipped off to concentration camps, 82 children in camps, only 17 survivors. And then the point about the Lidice committees, people like Einstein, Chaplin, and Thomas Mann. But then we're told that many towns were renamed Lidice as a memorial, and so it actually became a girl's name in many parts of the world. And then when the end credits start scrolling, on the right hand side we get the actual film credits, which are just coming up now. But on the left hand side we get a roll call of people called Lidice, many of whom are obviously many decades younger than the now destroyed town. And that really struck me as a very sort of proof that certain kinds of protest can be very quiet, almost you wouldn't really notice it with these individual people, but when listed in one go like this, it just becomes much more powerful. And clearly the aim was originally to keep the name of Lidice alive, which they have obviously managed with spectacular success. There are hundreds and hundreds of names on this list. The credits go on for 6 minutes, but I think we run out of time well before then. Right, well, 2 decades after World War II saw a reshaping of the globe, with many colonial powers losing their various possessions. We lost India and parts of Africa and other so-called pink bits, and the French lost Algeria. This last event was documented by Guillermo Pontecorvo's film The Battle of Algiers, which, like Eisenstein's October, was a reconstruction made on the original locations with the enthusiastic support of the independent Algerian government. Its incisive analysis of how street protest leads to all-out revolution has been used in various contexts. Several terrorist groups, from the Black Panthers to the IRA, have allegedly used it as a training film. It was screened in the White House during the Iraq invasion, and it was shown to the Algerian football team as a morale booster during the 2010 World Cup. This clip comes from the very end of the film, when the population of Algiers spontaneously takes to the streets, and the French clearly don't know how to handle them.
Malgré la pression des milieux colonialistes les plus intransigeants, il paraît que le gouvernement ait donné des ordres sévères de l'utiliser les armes comme dernière extrémité. Mais des quartiers musulmans, ces cris incompréhensibles, scandés, effrayants.
Now, virtually everything I've shown you so far has been a sort of professionally made 35mm feature film. But while the 1930s was marked by the coming of sound, the 1960s saw a no less significant technical breakthrough in the form of a widespread availability of lightweight 16mm cameras that could shoot synchronized sound without needing a separate recording device, thus reducing the size of film crews and offering new opportunities for independent, low-budget filmmaking. Cinema Action was one of the many groups that took advantage of this, and their film UCS-1 gave Applied Shipyard Strike wholly sympathetic treatment that it would have struggled to get in the mainstream media. But Britain was, broadly speaking, a free country. So how did filmmakers manage to convey protests in countries where filmmaking was so rigorously controlled that receipts for raw footage had to be provided before festival screenings of finished films could be authorised? In 1970s Poland, a country with as strong and distinguished a documentary tradition as Britain, direct criticism of the communist government was completely forbidden. But increasingly throughout what was widely recognised as a pretty grim decade, even by Polish standards, documentary and fiction filmmakers came up with subtle ways of reflecting their audience's experience. 2 decades before he made the Three Colours trilogy, Krzysztof Kieślowski was a documentary maker who specialised in fly-on-the-wall studies of workplaces, films with titles like Factory, Hospital, Railway Station, in which criticism of inefficient systems tended to be delivered in casual asides like this.
Ja nie miałem, wiesz, nie chodzi o zredagowanie, po prostu podania zorganizowania, czyli muszę koeficjent pomóc napisać odwołanie, no bo chyba kapitalizm umiera na ręce po prostu.
Dobrze, ale co ona ma oprócz ślepoty?
No ślepotę, no wystarczy, no ślepotę i pieniędzów nie ma, no nie ma pieniędzy, nie ma za co żyć. No. Staruszka 60 lat, no. 64, no ale
Tylko to opieka społeczna.
Opieka
No, opieka.
Opieka to jest też opieka. No. Czasami przyjdzie, czasami nie przyjdzie. A jak nie było pracowało?
The films from this period, the mid to late 70s, became known as the cinema of moral anxiety, and cumulatively they made a powerful impression on Polish audiences. But in 1980, the country seemed to be on the verge of a genuine political breakthrough as a strike at the Gdansk shipyard led to the founding of the Solidarity trade union, which at its peak boasted a quarter of the Polish population as paid-up members. Andrzej Wajda, who was at the time probably the most internationally famous filmmaker still working in Poland, realised that this was potentially a political earthquake in the making and decided to document it in the form of a fiction feature with factual elements called Man of Iron. It's about a journalist hired to spy on solidarity activists and dig up dirt on them, eventually inevitably coming round to their cause. It was shot on location at the Gdansk shipyard, and in this clip the 2 men walking by are actors, but the strikers are real.
Niekiedy jedynym sposobem zbliżenia z rodzinami. Połączenie zaproponowane od dnia 20 sierpnia 1980 roku z wymagamy się
there's this wedding scene.
Udzieli swojego błogosławieństwa.
Now the couple and the priest are played by actors. In fact, those are two major Polish stars, Krystyna Janda and Jerzy Bezygurowicz. But the people in the background, here we go, are real solidarity activists, including one of them, one of the most famous men on the planet. That is actually Lech Wałęsa in the middle. Apparently he took some persuading to appear in this, and it's easy to see why, because it's the sort of thing that could easily have backfired. But his presence in this film, interacting with actors and a fictional story, effectively amounts to an endorsement of the film's message. If this was a sort of US political campaign ad, he'd be saying, I am Lech Wałęsa and I endorse this message. Very simple a line, don't we have? That is him, yes, that is Lech Wałęsa playing himself, absolutely, yes. The film was shot very quickly in the autumn of 1980 and premiered in Poland in February 1981 and provoked a fascinating reaction. As the end credits rolled, the audience stood up and sang the national anthem. And in that context, it was a clear act of civil disobedience. They were saying they regarded Weiler's film as being truer to the spirit of Poland than the communist government. It went on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival and an Oscar nomination, becoming one of the key international solidarity texts. And when the government declared martial law in December 1981, they banned the film and shut down Weiler's production unit, forcing him into exile, where among other things he made one of his best-known films, Danton. But the film was a huge hit on Poland's underground VHS market. Actually, I should use the word market, I don't think anyone can change hands. And this is another major technical breakthrough, and a really fundamental one, because what VHS videotape lacked in quality, it more than made up for in versatility. You no longer had to rent a format and project it to screen independent productions. All you needed was to use absolutely bog standard radio rentals VCRs, and you could create your own underground distribution network based largely or entirely in people's private homes, which was much harder to police. And here in Britain, this was demonstrated during our next major strike, which was in the mid-1980s, the miners' strike. Frustrated by the way that the mainstream media, even Channel 4, were failing to convey their point of view, the miners and sympathetic campaigners started making and distributing their own videos.
You see, if I was pit shut, we were to a pit 4 or 5 miles away. Well, there's lads who just screw now. There will be a concrete lid on the pit where we were. Their carts are moving 4 or 5 miles away, do they screw? It's just shutting the pits. Doing exactly the same in 1926. 26 they tried to cut wages because they couldn't compete. There's no fault of ours, we've increased productivity. Our job is to produce coal, not to sell it. They can't sell it, that's what we're doing. To capture this stocks and follow. We just produce the stuff. It's a nationalised industry, it's this country's birthright coal, it lasts for 400 years. We're buying coal off South Africa, which slaves produce, £10 a month.
And in the last 15, 20 years, we've enjoyed what is, with no exaggeration, the biggest communications revolution since Capstone and Gutenberg's printing presses, thanks to the advent of the World Wide Web, blogging, YouTube, Twitter, Flickr, and other social networks, coupled with a plunge in the cost of production. In my pocket, I contain something that has a video camera capable of producing superior quality images to what we saw in the miners' campaign. Things, it also has basic editing software, and if I hop into a Wi-Fi quick cafe, I can publish stuff on YouTube immediately. Naturally, this has led to a glut of videos featuring kittens falling over, but it's also had a phenomenal impact on the coverage of major protest movements, particularly in countries considered too dangerous to send professional news crews, Syria being a good current example. And in China, the artist Ai Weiwei has been using various social networks to get his own dissident messages across. When the authorities banned his blog and YouTube channel, he simply turned to Twitter. They've tried to silence him by detaining him for nearly 3 months and banning him from going online as a bail condition, but it's been noticeably ineffective, not least because his many followers, most of whom are based outside China, keep up a strong online presence on his behalf. So in 100 years, we've gone from a situation where moving images of protest are carefully controlled by political and economic forces to one where absolutely anyone can have their own global platform. And what the next few decades will bring is frankly anyone's guess.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Harry?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm still here. Yeah, great stuff.
We're sort of hurtling towards 8 o'clock, so I don't want this to go on much longer, but I thought it would be nice to have a few questions and a few comments. Was there anything you would like to say, Harry, having seen Michael's presentation and thinking about that ricocheting off the research and your own presentation?
I suppose my main question will be what's coming next, because you took us up to this current moment and then touched very lightly on how a huge shift in communications technologies is affecting the way that protest is documented or presented, both in actuality and fictionally, and that's a change in the relationship between power and technology. And I'm wondering, where do you see that going? What changes do you see coming?
I mean, I thought the point you made about how we are heavily reliant on huge corporations like Facebook, Google, which of course runs YouTube and so on, is a very good one, because of course it does. I mean, the point I made was absolutely correct. I can go and upload pretty much any kind of video I want within a matter of a few minutes. Once it leaves my phone and goes up onto YouTube, I'm no longer in control of it to anything like the same extent. They are perfectly capable of banning it, censoring it for whatever reason. Facebook has had some rather idiosyncratic censorship policies of late. Exposed breasts, for instance, in whatever context, like breastfeeding, they're not very keen on.
Yeah.
And they tend not to warn you. And quite often the rules tend to be sort of fairly arbitrary.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to bring Turi Munt in. Turi is the founder of Demotix, and obviously the reason you and I are in touch, Harry.
Yes.
So,
in fact, we've been tweeting each other while this presentation's been going on.
Fantastic.
There's technology for you.
There you go. Bouncing back and forth. So, I mean, Turi, maybe do you want to have a comment or a question?
Well, I want to ask exactly the same question, which is how, according to what criteria can we imagine protest taking shape out of technology? There are a couple of things that I've seen over the last 18 months or so that don't bode well at all. One of them is in the aftermath of the Tunisian revolution, all these people who managed to get together via the social networks, via these new bits of technology. One of the core organisers tried to build a new manifesto for Tunisia on Google Docs, which is a fabulous idea, obviously, because it tries to crowdsource in the same way that they crowdsourced protest. They tried to crowdsource the building of the next phase. It was an unmitigated instant disaster. And we see that seems to be time and again, if you look at where Egypt is today. But if you look also at the way Occupy has turned in the last few months, because of the failure of technology to provide, it seems to me, a future direction for these protests, we've had a reversal to very old-fashioned 20th century modernist politics. You see it in Egypt today, where you have a 50s version of Islamism on the one hand versus really old-style 20th century military regime on the other. And in Greece, you've had a return now to one of the most frightened political parties around today, which has a Photoshop version of the swastika flag and got 7.5% of the vote. We'll talk about the New Dawn.
And apparently 50% of the police vote, which is actually
even more frightening. So yes, there's a return. So protests have been absolutely fascinating over the last 18 months. But what it has generated, it seems to me, is a return to modernist politics. Really old-fashioned modernist politics. So technology has failed completely to make that next step.
Is that a failure of technology or a failure of political imagination?
Right, that's I think probably perhaps one of the problems which emerges, which is exemplified by this failed Google Doc attempt to build a Tunisian manifesto, is that when you have all these various different voices coming together, it's very hard to come up with a consistent grammar. You brought up this idea of language, a language approach, which I think is absolutely correct, but a consistent grammar for that next phase. And I, off the top of my head, actually for much longer, I've been thinking about who may represent the extension of Occupy to a sort of a formal political movement, and I can't think of anybody who has that voice.
Well, it reminds me of, I guess, where Harry's presentation ended, or one of the last chapters, which was, I guess, you bringing in neoliberalism and sort of suggesting perhaps that if that is that's the sort of the defining or a recent defining moment of historical contingency, that protest. You said the only thing they have in common is the thing that they're against. So we know what we have in common in relation to our so-called enemy, but once that enemy is something as abstract as neoliberal capital or neoliberal power, the definition is through a negative, but the moment you want to assert a positive, then the kind of sort of faction lines in the aggregate of that protest seem to come to the fore, so I wondered whether Harry, you felt in terms of your work as someone who uses theatre politically, what do you think of how would you react to Turi's statement there?
Oh, well, there's a few different things there. One of them is that I think technology doesn't determine anything by itself. So an attempt to make a manifesto by Google Docs fails, well, partly because Google Docs is really bad collaborative editing software. Partly because the social conditions to use it right weren't there. Because collaborative editing has had extraordinary successes. When you think about Wikipedia, when you think about this ability to create an encyclopedia as accurate as the Encyclopedia Britannica and 100 million times more comprehensive, and through collaborative editing, you know that kind of collective action is possible. But that's been determined by a series of social and economic conditions. So what technology can achieve and what can be done by technology depends on what the social and political relations around that technology are, which is why who controls the technology becomes an important question. So that's one aspect of this relationship between technology and protest. The other is that over the last couple of decades, I mentioned this idea of one no, many yeses, which has come out of the anti and ultra-globalization movement, which is the idea that you can link in solidarity hundreds of different movements together by saying that they're all opposing the institutions and effects of this one philosophy that now dominates the world, but what they then positively say, what they positively want in each location is different. So the Zapatistas in Mexico, who did a lot to expand this philosophy, are opposing one particular exertion of neoliberal power through NAFTA and through the Mexican state. So they're doing one thing, and the protesters on Wall Street demanding a change in our banking practices are doing another thing. They're connected in what they oppose, but they're asking for different things, they're giving different demands. So there's a way of achieving a kind of coherent movement through that. I suppose what I've been suggesting is that something feels a bit different right now than it did 10 years ago, and I'm still not quite sure where that's going.
Just one quick question for you, Michael. I mean, I thought what was really interesting in your history was that, well, I guess that there are different. We're talking about who has the power to narrate protest
and to distribute.
And to distribute, absolutely. And then there are these categories, and I thought the Eisenstein is really interesting, and where you say that this, in the absence of the actual No one had an iPhone or an Android phone at that point. So the dramatized revisionist historical enactment becomes the de facto.
I think history programs that use that footage are generally pretty scrupulous about making it clear where it came from. But a kind of subtitle footnote is not going to be enough to put. You think back to the storming of the Winter Palace, and you try and imagine it as a moving image. It will be images from Eisenstein's October, which, as we know, are massively exaggerated. It simply didn't happen like that. Battle of Algiers, I think, is a lot more accurate. But of course, he's trying something similar because, again, it looks like a documentary. It isn't. Every single frame of Battle of Algiers was recreated about 5 years after the event.
But do you think, therefore, that with the advent of all of this stuff that we can all produce, and the juries platform mediates between citizen journalists and the public, will this, by definition, sort of see slow disappearance and the eradication of protest as a subject for dramatics? And
I think it would. I think it will have to take on different forms. I think something like. Actually, at the same time that Andre Heider was making Man of Iron, Ken Loach abandoned fiction filmmaking for a time because he thought that the Thatcher government needed far more instant responses, because developing a feature film takes months, minimum, sometimes years, often years. So he turned to non-fiction documentary making, and then he had several run-ins with Channel 4, which either censored or refused to show some of his documentaries about the miners' strike. So, ironically, and he wouldn't have had that problem if he'd carried on making fiction. So that was one of the reasons he eventually went back into making fiction.
are there any comments? If not, I'm mindful of the time and mindful of Harry's time, who's an hour ahead. So with that, I really would like to thank you so much, Harry, for your contribution both on the video and in person. Thank you so much. And thank you to Micheal Brooke, and thank you all for coming. And next format is next Wednesday, which is SPAN format, so please join us for that. Thank you so much.